The wind howled outside, rattling the loose shutters on the side of the small-town repair shop. Rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the streets into dark rivers beneath the flickering glow of the street lamps inside. The smell of motor oil, damp, concrete, and worn leather filled the air. Ethan Cole stood hunched over an old pickup truck, a single lamp casting a warm circle of light over his workbench. His hands, calloused and stained with years of labor, tightened one last bolt before he let out a tired sigh. His back ached, and his eyelids felt heavy. But there was still one thought keeping him awake. His 9-year-old son, Noah, was waiting for him at home with a plate of reheated leftovers and a smile that could push away even the longest day. Life hadn't been easy since his wife passed away. The bills stacked higher each month, the rent seemed to creep up when he least expected it, and the garage barely brought in enough to cover the basics. But Ethan kept going, not because he had to, but because Noah deserved more than just survival. He deserved a future. He was just about to turn off the light when he heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rain. Ethan froze, listening. Sometimes kids would mess around near the shop, or a delivery driver would drop something off late. But it was almost midnight. No one should be here. Another knock came, louder this time, slow, hesitant. Ethan's brow furrowed. He wiped his hands on a rag, his boots echoing softly against the concrete as he walked toward the side door. The storm outside made it hard to see through the narrow glass pane, but a shadow moved just beyond the light. "Hello?" he called out, his voice carrying a mix of caution and curiosity. There was no answer, just the muffled sound of the rain hitting the metal roof. And it was that, breathing. Something in his gut told him this wasn't just a stranger looking for directions. He unlatched the door, and the cold night air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet asphalt. Standing there, drenched and shivering, was a woman clutching a small boy to her chest. Her hair clung to her face, and her clothes were soaked through. But it was her eyes that made Ethan's chest tighten. They were wide with fear, the kind of fear that comes from running for too long. The boy, no older than 7, clung to her side, his small hands gripping her coat. His lip was trembling, not just from the cold. "Please," the woman's voice cracked, barely louder than the rain. We didn't know where else to go." Ethan glanced past them, but the street was empty. No cars, no movement, just darkness swallowing the edges of the town. "Come inside," he said without thinking, stepping back so they could enter. The boy's shoes squelched against the floor, leaving tiny puddles with each step. Ethan grabbed a clean blanket from a workbench and wrapped it around the boy. Then another for the woman. He wanted to ask 100 questions. Who were they? Why were they out in this weather? What happened? But something in the way the woman held her son stopped him. Her hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from holding on too tightly, as if letting go even for a moment would mean losing him forever. "I'm Ethan," he finally said softly. "And you are?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door as if she was expecting someone or something to follow her in. "My name is Grace," she whispered, "and this is my son, Daniel." She paused, her throat tightening. "Please, don't tell anyone we're here." Outside, a car's engine roared past, its headlights flashing briefly against the shop's walls. Grace flinched, pulling Daniel closer. Ethan didn't miss it. Something was very wrong. And whatever it wasn't over. In that moment, Ethan had no idea that letting them in would change his life forever. That the woman and boy standing in his dimly lit garage were not who they appeared to be. And that behind their fear lay a secret worth more than anything he'd ever imagined. Ethan poured steaming water into a chipped mug and set it in front of Grace. She wrapped her hands around it like it was the only warmth she had left in the world. Daniel sat on a stool beside her, still wrapped in the oversized blanket, his eyes darting between his mother and the strange man who had let them in. The rain still pounded the roof, but now, inside the garage, the sound felt heavier, like it was sealing them away from whatever danger they had fled. Ethan leaned against his workbench, crossing his arms, waiting for Grace to speak. "You don't have to tell me everything," he began slowly. "But if you're in trouble, maybe I can help." Grace's gaze flickered toward the door again. "You can't help with this," she said softly, almost to herself. Daniel's small voice broke the silence. "Mama, he's nice." Something shifted in Grace's expression. She looked at Ethan then, really looked at him, like she was trying to decide if she could trust him. Her eyes held a storm of exhaustion, fear, and something else unspoken. Weight she'd been carrying far too long. "We've been running for weeks," she finally said. "We don't stay in one place more than a night. Tonight, we didn't make it out of town before the storm." "Running from who?" Ethan asked, though he kept his voice calm, not wanting to scare Daniel. Grace shook her head. "It's not who, it's what they want." Her hands trembled around the mug. "It's not safe for us to be found." Ethan's instincts were screaming. He'd seen people down on their luck before. He'd been one of them more than once, but this was different. Grace didn't look like someone who'd simply fallen on hard times. She looked like someone with something to lose, something people would chase her across miles to take. "You and your boy can stay here tonight," he said, his tone leaving. "No room for argument. We'll figure the rest out in the morning." Grace's lips parted, as if she wanted to refuse, but then she closed them again and nodded faintly. Ethan went to grab some extra clothes for them from a box of old donations a neighbor had dropped off weeks ago. When he came back, Daniel was already dozing against Grace's side, the blanket tucked under his chin. "You have kids?" Grace asked quietly. "One," Ethan said, a small smile tugging at his tired face. "Noah. He's 9. Grace nodded, her eyes softening for the first time since she walked in. "You're a good father. I can tell." Ethan almost laughed. Good fathers don't always have answers, but they do what they can. For a moment, the garage was filled only with the hum of the old space heater and the steady beat of the rain. Then, a sudden flash of light cut across the window headlights, slowing just outside. Grace stiffened instantly, her hand gripping Daniel protectively. Ethan stepped toward the door, his body blocking her from view. The vehicle idled for a moment, its engine low and steady, before it rolled away into the night. But Grace didn't relax. "Ethan," she said, her voice low but urgent, "if anyone comes asking about us, promise me you'll say you've never seen us. Grace, promise me." She insisted, her eyes locking onto his with a desperation that was almost painful to see. Ethan hesitated, then gave a short nod. "I promise." Grace's shoulders sagged with relief, but only for a moment. She glanced at Daniel, sleeping peacefully, then back at Ethan. "You don't know what you've done by letting us in tonight," she whispered. Ethan didn't know it yet, but that was the truth, because the secret Grace carried wasn't just dangerous. It was worth a fortune that could change everything, and someone out there knew exactly where to find it. Ethan woke to the sound of something metallic rattling against the shop's back door. For a moment, he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again, slow, deliberate, like someone testing the lock. He slipped quietly out of the small cot in the corner, his bare feet barely making a sound against the concrete floor. The space heater still hummed softly near where Grace and Daniel slept, both curled under blankets. Grace's hand rested protectively on her son's shoulder, even in sleep. Ethan grabbed the heavy wrench from his workbench and crept toward the back of the garage. The rain had eased, but the night outside was still black and thick with fog. He stood still, holding his breath, listening. The noise stopped. He slowly unlocked the side door and opened it a crack. Nothing, just the damp smell of rain-soaked earth and the distant hiss of water draining along the street. When he turned back, Grace was sitting up, her eyes wide and alert. "What happened?" she asked in a low voice. "Probably nothing," he lied, setting the wrench down. "Just making sure everything's locked." She studied him for a moment, as if she could tell he wasn't being entirely truthful, but she didn't push. Instead, she glanced toward Daniel, still asleep, and whispered, "We should leave at first light." Ethan didn't like the way she said it, not as a suggestion, but as a necessity. "Grace, are you going to tell me what's going on?" Her jaw tightened. "The less you know, the safer you'll be." He shook his head. "I can't help you if I don't know what I'm up against." She looked at him then with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Ethan, what's coming for us isn't just trouble, it's dangerous. People have been hurt already." Before he could respond, the faint rumble of an engine drifted in through the thin garage walls. This time, it wasn't passing by, it was stopping, Ethan stepped toward the front window, pulling the blinds just enough to peek outside. A dark SUV idled at the far end of the street, its headlights off but its silhouette clear against the dim glow of the street lamps. Grace was already on her feet, clutching Daniel's small backpack. Her voice trembled as she said, "They found U.S." Ethan turned to her, who her answer was barely more than a breath. "People who think my son doesn't belong to me." The words struck him like a punch. "What do you mean?" But Grace was already moving, checking the doors, making sure Daniel was awake. The boy blinked sleepily, confused but obedient as his mother urged him to put on his shoes. Ethan's heart pounded. He didn't know why, but something deep inside told him this wasn't a moment to stand aside. Whoever those people were, they weren't here for anything good. The SUV door opened. A tall figure stepped out, his coat flapping in the wind, his posture sharp and deliberate. Even from a distance, Ethan could feel the authority in his movements. Grace grabbed Ethan's arm. "If they come in, don't tell them anything. Please, not even your name." Ethan looked down at her trembling hands and then at Daniel's wide, frightened eyes. He didn't know these people. He didn't know their past. But in that instant, he knew one thing: he wasn't about to let anyone take them without a fight. What he didn't realize was that this moment the choice to protect them would pull him into a world of secrets, betrayal, and unimaginable wealth. And by the end of it all, he'd learn that the boy sleeping in his garage wasn't just in danger. He was the rightful heir to an empire. The sound of boots on wet pavement grew louder, deliberate, each step echoing in the stillness. Ethan positioned himself near the garage door, his hands curling into fists out of habit. Grace stood just behind him, holding Daniel close. The boy's small fingers clutched the fabric of her coat, his wide eyes fixed on the shadow moving closer. A sharp knock broke the tense silence. It wasn't the hesitant tapping from earlier, it was firm, commanding. Whoever was on the other side wasn't asking for permission to come in. Ethan didn't move. Another knock, this time harder. "Open up," a voice called. Deep and calm, but laced with something cold. "We just want to talk." Grace shook her head almost imperceptibly. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "Don't." Ethan swallowed hard and stood still. He could feel the weight of that voice even through the door. It was the kind of tone used by people who were used to being obeyed. The man outside didn't seem bothered by the lack of response. "We know you're in there. You have something that belongs to us." Grace flinched, pulling Daniel tighter against her side. Ethan glanced back at her, his mind racing. "Is he talking about—" "Yes," she interrupted, her voice barely audible. "But Daniel isn't an object to be taken. He's my son." The man's shadow shifted as he stepped closer to the small window in the door. Ethan moved so that his own body blocked the view inside. "You can make this easy," the voice continued. "Open the door, and no one gets hurt." Ethan's jaw tightened. Not going to happen. For a few seconds, there was silence, thick, suffocating silence. Then the sound of footsteps retreating. Grace exhaled shakily, thinking they might be leaving, but Ethan didn't relax. He knew enough about trouble to recognize when it was simply circling back. He grabbed an old metal rod from the corner and checked the side entrance, making sure it was bolted. Grace's hands shook as she helped Daniel into his jacket. "We have to get out of here now," she whispered. Before Ethan could respond, the rumble of another engine joined the first. He peeked through the blinds. Another black SUV had pulled up, blocking the road. Grace's face went pale. They brought more. Ethan's heart pounded. He didn't know why, but something in him refused to step aside. Maybe it was the way Daniel looked at him with silent trust. Maybe it was the raw fear in Grace's eyes. Whatever it was, he knew this wasn't going to end with him just handing them over. The first man's voice came again, louder this time, carrying over the sound of the idling engines. "You're making a mistake. That child isn't yours." Daniel pressed his face against his mother's side, his voice muffled but certain. "Yes, I am." The simple words hit Ethan harder than anything else that had been said tonight. Grace looked at Ethan, her voice trembling. "If they take him, they'll never let me see him again." Something inside Ethan clicked. He'd been a single father long enough to understand this wasn't about wealth or property. This was about family. He turned back toward the door, tightening his grip on the metal rod. "Then they're not taking him," he said firmly. The man outside gave a short, humorless laugh. You don't understand who you're up against. Ethan's voice was steady. Maybe not. But I understand right and wrong. The sound of boots crunched closer to the door again. This time, it wasn't just one set, it was several. Grace's hand found Ethan's arm. If you help us now, there's no going back. He glanced at her, then at Daniel. I wasn't planning on going back anyway. Neither of them knew it yet, but the standoff was only the beginning. Soon, Ethan would uncover why they were being hunted and that Daniel's birthright wasn't just valuable. It was powerful enough to change the lives of everyone in that garage forever. The pounding on the door stopped as suddenly as it had started. The only sounds were the hum of the space heater and the deep rumble of the two SUVs sidling outside. Ethan's grip tightened around the metal rod, his eyes locked on the entrance. Grace stood frozen, her arm around Daniel, who was clutching her coat with both hands. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts. Ethan could feel her fear as if it were his own, and it only made his resolve stronger. Then, without warning, the garage was bathed in bright white light. It spilled in through the narrow windows, flooding every shadow, every corner. The men outside had turned on their high beams, and now their silhouettes stood in the glare tall. Sharp, deliberate. Last chance, the voice called again. Open the door. Ethan felt his chest tighten, but he didn't move. You're wasting your time, he shouted back. The man didn't argue this time. Instead, a different voice, lower, almost amused, echoed from the darkness. We know who you are, Grace. You can't hide him forever. You think a mechanic can protect you? Ethan felt her flinch behind him. The fact that they knew her name sent a chill through his spine. This wasn't random. They had been tracking her. He glanced at her quickly. You need to tell me what's going on. Now, her lips parted, but for a moment, she seemed to be fighting herself, torn between keeping the truth buried and finally letting it out. They want Daniel, she said quietly. Not because of me, because of his father. Ethan's brows drew together. Where's his father? She hesitated. Dead. At least, I thought so. But the people outside. She broke off, her eyes clouding with something between anger and grief. His father was the only son of one of the richest oil tycoons in the country. The family has more money and power than you can imagine. When Daniel was born, they wanted to take him away from me, said I wasn't fit to raise him. I ran, Ethan. I ran because I knew they'd never stop. Ethan stared at her, the pieces snapping together in his mind. You're saying your son is heir to an oil fortune? Grace nodded, her voice shaking. And to them, that's all he is, a legacy, a name to control. They don't care about him as a person. Outside, the sound of footsteps crunched closer. The men were spreading out, checking the sides of the building. Ethan's pulse quickened. So if they take him, they'll hide him away, raise him like a piece of property. I'll never see him again, she finished, her voice breaking. Ethan looked down at Daniel, who stared back at him with quiet trust, unaware of the weight of the words being spoken. In that moment, Ethan made a choice that surprised even himself. You're not losing him, he said firmly. Not tonight, not ever. Grace's eyes glistened. You don't understand, Ethan. Once they've found us, they don't give up. And if you stand in their way, then I stand in their way. He cut in. The sound of a hand rattling the side door snapped them back into the moment. Ethan's mind raced. Staying here wasn't an option. They'd eventually force their way in. There's a back exit through the storage room, he whispered. It opens into the alley. If we move now, we can lose them before they figure out we're gone. Grace hesitated only a second before nodding. Ethan moved quickly, grabbing his old work jacket and tossing it to her to hide her soaked clothes. He handed Daniel a baseball cap from a shelf. The rumble of voices grew louder outside. Time was slipping away. As they reached the back door, Grace stopped and looked at him. Why are you helping us? You don't even know me. Ethan glanced at Daniel, then back at her. Because I know what it's like to be afraid you'll lose the only family you have. And because sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't need a reason. They slipped out into the rain-dark alley. Just as a sharp bang echoed from the front of the garage, someone was trying to break the lock. Ethan didn't look back. They were running now, their footsteps splashing through puddles, hearts pounding in unison. What none of them knew was that this night would set off a chain of events that would uncover far more than a family feud over money. The truth about Daniel's father, the fortune he was born into, and the betrayal hiding in plain sight was only beginning to surface. And by the time it did, Ethan's own life would be forever tied to theirs in ways he could never have imagined. The alley twisted into darkness, the smell of wet asphalt heavy in the air. Ethan kept his steps quiet but quick, guiding Grace and Daniel through the maze of narrow backstreets he knew by heart. The sound of engines revving somewhere behind them told him the men had realized they were gone. Grace clung to Daniel's hand, her eyes darting at every shadow. Ethan could feel her fear pressing in like the rain-soaked walls around them. "Where are we going?" she whispered. "There's an old storage building 2 blocks over," Ethan said without slowing down. "No one uses it anymore. We can hide there until I figure something out." She didn't question him, but he could tell her mind was racing. Every sound, the clink of a loose drainpipe, the drip of water from the roofs made her flinch. Halfway through the alley, a sharp beam of light sliced through the darkness from behind. "A flashlight." "Go," Ethan hissed, quickening his pace. They reached the side door of the storage building just as a voice echoed from the alley entrance. "They're here." Ethan shoved the door open and ushered them inside. The air inside was cold and dusty, filled with the scent of wood and rust. He pulled the door closed, locking it from the inside just as footsteps pounded closer. Grace knelt beside Daniel, holding him close. "Stay quiet," she whispered. Ethan moved to the cracked window, peering out. The men were splitting up to stayed in the alley, scanning with their flashlights, while another disappeared down the street. Grace's voice was low but urgent. "They won't stop, Ethan. They'll keep looking until they have him." He turned to her. "Then tell me everything, all of it. No more pieces." She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Daniel's father Michael was the only child of Harrison Vale. You've probably heard the name." Ethan nodded faintly. Vale Oil was everywhere: billboards, commercials, gas stations. The family was practically royalty in the energy world. "When I met Michael, he was nothing like the rest of them," Grace continued. "He wanted out of that life. He wanted to build something on his own. We fell in love. And when I got pregnant, he swore we'd raise our child away from all of it. But before Daniel was born, Michael was killed in an accident. At least, that's what I was told." Ethan studied her face. "You think it wasn't an accident?" She swallowed hard. "I know it wasn't. I overheard a conversation people from the company. They wanted control of Daniel's inheritance, and Michael was in the way." Her voice trembled. "I took Daniel and ran before they could make good on their threats." Ethan leaned back against the wall, processing. "And the men outside, part of the family's security," she said bitterly. "They don't work for me. They work for Harrison Vale." Daniel shifted against his mother's side. "I don't want to go with them, Mama," he whispered. Grace smoothed his hair. "You won't." Suddenly, heavy footsteps pounded against the storage building's side door. The lock rattled violently. Ethan grabbed a length of steel pipe from the floor and motioned for Grace to move with Daniel. Toward the far corner, a voice called from outside. "Grace Vale, open the door. You're surrounded. We're taking the boy." Her name echoed in Ethan's head. Vale. No wonder they wouldn't stop. He stepped closer to the door. "You're not taking anyone," he said firmly. There was a pause, then the same cold voice replied. "You have no idea who you're protecting. That boy is the future of an empire." Ethan glanced back at Daniel. "No," he said, his voice like steel. "He's a kid, and right now, he's under my roof. That makes him my responsibility." The lock snapped under the pressure from outside. The door burst open, and 2 men stepped in, dark coats dripping from the rain. Ethan didn't hesitate. The steel pipe swung hard, clanging against the frame. As one man ducked and stumbled, the other lunged forward, but Ethan caught him in the shoulder, forcing him back toward the door. Grace grabbed Daniel and bolted toward the opposite exit, pulling him into the rainy night. Ethan followed, slamming the door shut behind them as the men regained their footing. They ran through the downpour, every step splashing through puddles until the faint glow of streetlights appeared ahead. Ethan led them toward a diner still lit up for the late-night crowd. Inside, a phone hung on the wall behind the counter. He reached for it, his mind made up. I'm calling someone I trust, if what you're saying is true. Grace, we can't just keep running. We need to make this public, the truth about Michael, about Daniel, about everything." Grace stared at him. "You'd really go up against Harrison Vale?" Ethan glanced at Daniel, then back at her. "I'm not going up against him. I'm protecting your son. And I don't lose family." What none of them knew was that in less than a week, this fight would spill far beyond their small town. And when the world learned who Daniel really was, the Vale Empire would never be the same again. Because sometimes, the smallest act of kindness, a man opening his garage to strangers on a rainy night, can change the course of countless lives forever.